Hi, I'm Louis Falgu, and welcome to the Music Breakdown. And today I will be reviewing the latest Whalesong album, Radiance of a Thousand Suns. Now, the band actually reached out for me to do a review of this album and sent me a copy in advance. Previously, I'd also been sent their EP Gateway, which was the prior release to this. And Gateway didn't really leave any impression on me one way or the other. While I think the title track had some interesting drones being layered onto it throughout its runtime, it also relied very heavily on synthetic percussion sounds that got pretty awkward as the track went along, rather grating, and it just left me wishing for a more live and a fuller sound. But I will say that in a way I'm glad I heard it, because Radiance of a Thousand Suns is, first of all, far more ambitious than Gateway, but also a lot better. Thor Harris, who you may know as a percussionist from post-Reformation Swans, joins the band on this album, providing hammered dulcimer on a lot of these tracks. And it's actually amazing how much the dulcimer adds to this album. It's also very fitting because this band takes heavy inspiration from Swans on this album. Heavy inspiration. I would describe the sound of this record as like a combination of no-wave era Swans with post-Reformation era Swans, and then also throw some metal in there. A lot of the tracks on the first half of the album feature a similarly rhythmic approach to early Swans, generally layering guitar noise with intense drum grooves and drum rhythms, which lead vocalist Nithan Kielbasa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, then delivers brutal spoken word poetry on top of. But I do think that for the most part, lyrically, there's a more like spiritual, cosmic approach here rather than an outwardly disturbing one, although on the track Flesh, that is definitely the approach the band takes. So you're getting a different combination of imagery here, which brings out a different context to these brutal instrumentals a lot of the time. But that being said, the lyrical content is generally still pretty dreary, even if it's not outwardly grotesque. Take the opening track here, Black Hole, which is just despicable. It is horrid in, like, all the best ways. It's made up of these disgusting deep guitar growls that are then layered with additional noise, whether it be squealing high-pitched frequencies, hammered dulcimer, and mechanical hi-hat rolls. And when the vocals come over this with the lyric "black hole in my chest," it is, like, shocking. And it's not really a result of what's being said, it's just the way that's combined with the sound. It is so fucked up. This track definitely did take time to grow in me, especially as an opener, but over time I came to appreciate the way that it just kind of shocks the system right from the start. And I think it's smart that the band goes into the heavier Rebirth right after, which opens with this kind of generic metal riff, but eventually transitions into this really spacey, noisy guitar passage for most of the track. But it's still very driving, there's a lot of forward momentum to this riff. I just find that the recording brings out a lot of lush space in the sound of the guitar. The other purely heavy riff-oriented song here is Consumer, which is mostly carried by really sludgy bass lines, and is just like eaten up by a horn section the entire time. It honestly makes the track feel a little one note. I probably would have preferred it if the horns had been layered in over time, but by the time the second riff in this song comes in, a little after halfway through, the horns add so much, until the end of the track where it really just becomes cacophonous. But I think that the way these two heavier tracks are spaced out in the first half of the album here kind of leaves a lot to be desired pacing-wise. I really wish there was more balance between these heavier, sludgier metal tracks with the kind of noisy, rhythm-oriented stuff. And I mean, they do balance it out with tracks like Bliss and A Wound in the Sky, but even these tracks don't really change the pace of the album when they show up. The album kind of falls into a rut here in between Rebirth and Consumer, where a lot of the tracks aren't really standing out in terms of their tone. It does kind of feel like the album has hit a really huge valley. And although all of these tracks are solid enough on their own, they do sort of get tiring once you get through multiple of them. And A Wound in the Sky sounds nicely post-apocalyptic, but I do think the first section of this song really begins to wear itself out. Thankfully, the band releases into this blissful, noisy section at the very end, but it does not last long enough. And I would say the same thing about the noisy coda section at the end of Rebirth, which I also wish was a little bit longer. Now, I've been talking a lot about the first half of this album because I think things change in the second half of the album. And when I say the second half of the album, I mean the title track, which is 48 minutes long. Now, for starters, I have to commend the band for, even trying here, because a 48-minute song is, needless to say, ambitious as hell, and they honestly pull it off. The song is structurally remarkably similar to Bring the Sun Toussaint Louverture in the sense that there's the louder climactic first half, a midsection with some sound effects, and then a sort of post-apocalyptic groove with some spoken word on top. Although the approach is definitely different here, and I mean, I will say, if you're gonna borrow the structure for a song that's this long, I'm okay with you borrowing the structure from Bring the Sun Toussaint Louverture, that's awesome. I mean, how am I supposed to complain about that? But anyway, the song opens on Thor Harris's constant hits of the dulcimer, which then this enormous heavy drone is layered on top of, as the vocals chant out the core idea of the track with, religious fervor, until the song explodes into this simple polyrhythm created by a triple meter on the drums and a duple meter on the guitar. It's a simple groove that is constantly hammered out for nearly 15 minutes, maybe even more. And considering that the guitar and bass only play one note for a lot of this section, it is undoubtedly demanding, but it's also undoubtedly sick as fuck. It becomes so hypnotic that whenever the band introduce just small variations, it really feels like something big has happened. And towards the end of this section, it just becomes these really huge, bright guitar strums over and over and over. It's really lush, and as the band coasts out of this section, I think they do a good job transitioning into the flatter half of the track, which consists of a much more understated groove, but still fairly heavy. And it really just becomes the room for the lead vocalist to begin to offer the rest of the poem here, kind of. And his delivery is great. But, I mean, I don't know. After 15 minutes of this section, his performance isn't so commanding that it really screams at you to pay attention. I think it does become very hypnotic, and it sort of goes to the background, I think. Not necessarily in a bad way, though. And I think that the space the band allows for this spoken word really does it a lot of justice, before the song concludes in a pretty massive drone. I mean, look, the band crafted a 48-minute song that is thoroughly enjoyable, and that's all I can ask for. That's crazy. Although taken on the whole with the rest of the album, it leaves me wishing that the band really capitalizes on this potential going forward, because this album does have some stylistic variation, and I feel like it might be worth leaving some of the more rhythmic tracks behind and focusing on these heavier tracks, because it seems like for the most part that's where this band's strength is. And I could see them doing some pretty crazy stuff, mixing post-rock with metal. But as it stands, this is a thoroughly enjoyable record. It seems like a massive step up from what I heard from the band prior, and I would be looking forward to see whatever they're able to come up with next. So overall, I would give Radiance of a Thousand Suns a good 7.5 out of 10. It's an impressive and ambitious effort that is thoroughly enjoyable as well, and leaves me wanting more from the band. And if you're a fan of Swans, I would definitely suggest checking this out, because this band could end up taking this sound places that Swans never really did. Bye, guys.